Hey, this is Ben with a bonus video about printing in Photoshop. Let's take a look at what's involved. I'd like to print this image, so I will go to the File menu, and I'll choose Print, and that will bring up the general options for printing. Now, this dialog, you should be aware, can be expanded. Just grab the corner, click on it, and drag, and make it, fill your screen. That makes it a little bit more convenient. Then on the right side, we have a bunch of options. I'll collapse all of those down, and we'll start up here at the very top, and then we'll work in reverse order on our way up from the bottom. Let's take a look at what we can do. First up, at the very top, we can choose which printer we would like to print to. Now, if you find that your printer is not listed here, then you're going to need to click on this button called Print Settings. And if you do, that at the top will also list the same printers, but you'll have the choice of Add Printer. Now, this is on a Mac. On Windows, I don't have a Windows machine, but it should be somewhat similar. You'd be able to add a printer there. Now, I'm going to choose I want that printer, but before I get out of this screen, which remember I got to by clicking on Print Settings up here, the other thing I mainly want to change here is possibly what size paper I would like to use, and that is chosen in this menu here. And so I'm going to come in here and say I want to print on a letter size paper, and I want it to be borderless so I can print all the way to the edge. And so I'll choose that setting. Now, this will be different depending on what kind of printer you're printing to. I happen to be printing to an Epson. If you're printing to a Canon or other brand, you'll have different options there. I'm going to click Save, and then let's look at what else we have in here. First, we have the number of copies we want to print. Most of the time, that's just one, but if you happen to need 6 copies or whatever, you can type the number in there. Below that, we have the orientation of the paper. Would we like it to be vertical, or would we rather rotate it to a horizontal orientation? And you can do that with these icons. Then, let's look at the options below, starting at the bottom. Now, a lot of these options will not be available because the printer that I've chosen to print to is a non-PostScript printer. PostScript printers are primarily used for publishing, where if you're used to doing page layout, illustration, that type of thing, instead of strictly photography, you might work with a PostScript printer. But in this case, this particular printer is not PostScript, so therefore these options, called PostScript options, they're simply disabled. It's a printing language that this printer doesn't understand. So let's go to the next section up. Here under Functions, we have a bunch of controls that you usually will not need to deal with. Negative and emulsion down have to do with printing negatives, as if you're going to create a printing plate you will later print with on a printing press. This would invert the picture to make it a literal negative of itself, that type of thing. We have the choice called Background, and what that does is if our picture did not fill the entire page, and I'm going to make it so mine doesn't fit the entire page here for a moment, then this empty area surrounding the image, by choosing background, I will get a color picker and I could use any color I would like, and it will fill in the areas that are not filled with the image. I'll choose background once again. I'll set that back to white because I don't want anything special out in that undefined area. Border would add a black border around our images. I'll come around here and put in maybe a 6-point border, and you'll see a black border appear around the edge of the picture. Just not very often I need that. Fine if you do, but I don't usually, so I'll leave it set to 0. Bleed has to do with printing beyond the edge of the cropped area of your paper, and that's mainly used when printing on a printing press. So in general, these areas under Functions, most of the time you can ignore them. Above that, we have printing marks. And let's say we came in here and somehow, and I'll describe this later, but let's just say somehow I made this image a lot smaller than it is, and maybe it took up a lot less space. Then I can come down here to printing marks, and let's say the image didn't fill the whole image, the whole paper that is, I could turn on corner crop marks. And therefore, if I was going to print this image small and I want to use an X-Acto knife or a pair of scissors to cut it out, this would tell me exactly where to cut. Because your picture doesn't always contain information all the way out to the edge. You might sometimes have white on the edge of the picture, and you couldn't tell the difference between where the white edge of your photo is and the actual white sheet of paper. So those crop marks would help you remember exactly where you should crop the image. You have a bunch of other choices. You have center crop marks, rarely needed. Registration marks would be if you were going to print separate sheets of paper for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and you need them to line up, you could use that, but I doubt you need it. You also have a choice called label, which will put the file name at the top of your file, or the top of the print. And you also have a choice called description, and a little button on the right called edit, and I would say this is the description. You might, whoops, I thought I was typing in there. You might type in something here to describe why you're making this print. So when you click OK, you can see the text down here at the bottom, and therefore maybe you say first proof before color correction or something else. It's up to you, but most of the time you just don't need the text there. So you can see that most of the features in these areas down below are not that exciting. But then we get to this area called position and size, and that's quite important. And first off, we have the choice of centering the image. That's the default, I believe. And I'm going to turn on a checkbox called Scale to Fit Media. That will scale up the image as large as we could possibly get it without cutting anything off when we print. And so that's a nice way to print a lot of the time, but sometimes you need an exact size. And if that's the case, you can come in here and turn off Scale to Fit Media, and right here you'll find a width and a height. So let's say we need to print this thing 7 inches tall, so I'll type in 7. Now, these numbers don't have a measurement system over on the right. Instead, it's found just below. Down here, it says inches. If I were to change this to centimeters, now you'd see the number change because it just converted what was there to centimeters. You can use whatever measurement system you need there if you need to type in an exact measurement. Below that, it says print resolution, and this says after you've scaled your picture, how much information are we printing in each inch? And you just need to make sure that that doesn't become too low. Like if you grab a web graphic that's really tiny and you try to print it full page, you might find that that number gets really low, like maybe down at 70 or 30 or something like that, and it might look pixelated. But if that number is 300 or above, you're good to go. You're not going to see any of the pixels that make up the image. There is a choice below called Print Selected Area. And before I chose print, I selected an area right near this guy's face. And if I turned that on, it wouldn't print the entire picture. It would instead only print that area that I had selected. That can be useful if you have a really huge print. You plan on making something, let's say a print 5 feet wide, and you just want to test something to see if the sharpening is good or something. You don't need to make a print 5 feet wide to test that. Instead, you might just select the most important area, turn on that print selected area choice, and now you're only going to print that area for your testing, and you don't have to print the entire picture. Therefore, you can print it on a smaller sheet of paper. Now, if you don't want to center the image, you can turn off center, and right here you have top and left. Let's say I type in 1, that means 1 inch from the top of the paper, and maybe 2 inches, meaning 2 inches from the left edge. But most of the time, I don't deal with these numbers, because you can actually move your mouse on top of the image in this preview over here and grab the corner. And if you do, you can pull on it and change its size. And when you do, it's just changing the scale setting on the right side of my screen to determine how big the image will be. And then if I click and drag on the image, I can move it wherever I'd like on the page. And that's going to simply change the top and left settings over here on the right side of my screen. Or if you prefer, you can always lock it to the center and Scale to Fit Media. It's up to you. Now, we're going to next get to the most important area of printing, and that is color management. If you don't adjust the color management settings, you can easily end up with an image that looks nothing like what you see on your screen. And so let's see how these settings affect our image. First, here's an area called color handling, and you can either have your printer handle the conversion of your image so that it prints correctly, or you can have Photoshop handle it. Now, if you have Photoshop handle the conversion, then you'll have additional options here within the print dialog, and therefore, I prefer to have Photoshop handle that. So I'm going to change this from Printer Manages Colors to Photoshop Manages Colors. And only when I have it set to Photoshop Manages Colors will I have a pop-up menu below. This is where I tell Photoshop what type of paper, printer, and ink I'm printing with. These are known as ICC color profiles, and these are installed at the time that you install your printer driver. I'm going to say I'm going to print to this Epson printer on premium luster paper. Then, because I have Photoshop managing our colors, now I have these additional options below our preview. There's a choice called Match Print Colors. If that's turned off, here it's just showing you what the image looked like when you're working with it in Photoshop. It does not attempt to simulate any changes that would happen when you print. But if you turn on Match Print Colors, you will find the color of the image shifting, usually making it look a little bit duller, to make it look more like it will when it prints. Also, there's a choice here on the right side called Show Paper White. Let's say you're printing on newsprint, like, the actual newspaper. Well, that is nowhere near as bright as the white that you see on your screen. And if you turn that on, you'll find the whites in the image and the bright areas in general will become just as dull as the kind of paper you've told Photoshop you're printing on. Finally, there's a choice here called Gamut Warning. And Gamut Warning means show me the parts of my image that are too vivid to actually be printed without changing them. Now, it doesn't mean that those areas are going to look bad or anything else. It's just telling you these particular parts of the image will look different than what you originally saw on screen. So I'll turn on Gamut Warning. You'll see gray appear on top of my image to indicate that those areas just are too vivid to be printed using the current paper and ink setup. And so those areas will shift. So those are the areas after you make a print you might want to visually investigate to see, do they still look good? And if they don't, you might want to make additional adjustments in Photoshop. Turn that off. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing on the image. It just means that those parts will look slightly different. So then let's look at the other options that we have. In this area down here, we have relative colorimetric and black point compensation. That's usually what I have this set to when I'm printing. The black point compensation will make sure the dark parts of my image map to the darkest part my printer can reproduce. There's a choice here called Send 16-bit Data. If you ever have any really smooth transitions in a sky, let's say it's a panorama where it goes from one shade of deep blue to a lighter shade of blue all the way on the other side of the image. Well, if that's the case, you'll want to turn on this checkbox, and that will send a lot of additional information to your printer to try to create a smoother end result in those really fine gradations in your image. It'll take a little longer to print because it's more data, but it's usually a good thing to use. Then there are some additional settings we need to specify, and we're going to get to them by clicking on Print Settings. When I click on Print Settings, it brings up the standard settings that my operating system would present to me when printing. And we were in here before. This is one place where you could add a printer, and this is where we could choose our paper size. But if I come down here, there's a choice called Color Matching. And if I have this dialog set for Photoshop Manages Colors, then when I choose Print Matching, this should be grayed out, simply unavailable. And that means that Photoshop is handling the print managing, not my printer driver. Let me show you how it would be different if I were to change this to Printer Manages Colors. Then when I go to Print Settings with this button up above, and I come down here to Color Matching, I would actually have choices available. And this is where I'd end up telling it what kind of paper and printer I'm using. But the problem with that is if I have the printer manage the colors, I'll click Cancel here, then we won't be able to preview what it's going to look like. We won't be able to see what paper white looks like. We won't be able to see the parts of the image that will be shifted. So I prefer to have Photoshop manage the colors. And when I do that, if I click on Print Settings, this area called Color Matching will be grayed out because Photoshop is handling those settings right over here on the right side of my screen. And all I have to do is make sure this choice called Printer Profile is set to the type of paper and printer I plan to print to. Now I'll show you how to install these later on. Pretty much when you install your printer driver, the thing that allows you to print, it will install these for you. But there is a place in Photoshop or on your operating system where you could manually put these in. So there's where I choose the kind of paper I want. Then I can also go back up to Print Settings, and there are some other settings you'd like to specify. Color matching will be grayed out because we're having Photoshop manage that. But if we come down here to Printer Settings, this is where we can also tell it which paper we would like to use. because we might need to get it so that the printer determines what kind of ink to use. Because oftentimes you have a different black ink for glossy paper versus matte paper, and this is where it determines that. It might also change some of the other printing settings based on that setting. You'll find when we go to advanced color settings, you can't get to it because Photoshop's managing all that stuff. This is the only area where we really have things set up. We'll hit save. So now we have this all set up for printing. And we have two buttons at the bottom we can use. Done, which means I'm not ready to print yet. I've just set it up with the correct settings. Or print, which actually means to start printing. Right now, I'm going to click done so I get back to the image itself. Now, here's what's cool. If I save this image in Photoshop file format or TIFF file format, those settings that I've specified will be saved with the image, so that the next time I open it, if I choose print, it will remember the settings. And therefore, I could print in the same settings again. If I don't save the image right now, then it won't remember those settings, and the next time I try to print, it will come in with default settings. And I'll have to remember it and go through all that stuff again. Now, here in Photoshop, let's say I want to preview what would that image look like when it's printed. Because when I print on, let's say, a matte paper, it can't create as vivid of colors as what I can see here in Photoshop. So what you can do is go up to the View menu, and that's where you're going to find a choice called Proof Setup. Proof means preview, like preview what it'll look like on a different device. And by default, it'll usually be set to working CMYK, and that means it's thinking about printing on a printing press. And for us, I'm thinking about printing on a desktop printer. And so therefore, none of these settings are going to help me. I'm going to need to choose Custom at the top. When I do, I'm going to find some of the same settings I found in the Print dialog. Right here it says Device to Simulate. I click and I say, what specific device do I want to preview on screen? And if I scroll down enough, I'll find my printer profiles. And I was down here on my P600 Epson printer, and I use premium Leicester paper. So I'll choose that. Down here, these are the same settings that are found in the Print dialog. You just leave them alone. Here's Simulate Paper Color, and if you want the whites of your image to be dulled down to look like the actual color of the paper, most of the time I'd want that on, and I click OK. Now, by setting that up, remember I went to the View menu to get to it, I chose Proof Setup and Custom. But when I did that, after I've specified it, it automatically turned on this setting called Proof Colors. And that means it's actually showing me what this image should look like on that printer. If I turn off Print Colors, you'll find the image shift. It will usually look more vivid because we can create much more vivid colors on our screen than we can print. If I turn on Proof Colors again, the colors will become slightly duller to show me what would it look like on that particular device being printed. Then, if you remember when we were in the Print dialog box, there was a checkbox right below the image called Gamut Warning, and it would show me which parts of the image would shift and look slightly different when printed. Well, if I go to the View menu, there's a choice called Gamut Warning, and it does exactly the same thing here in Photoshop. It doesn't mean you need to adjust those areas to make them so they're not gray. It simply means to look at those areas critically to see if there's an issue with it. And if there is, then adjust those areas. Now you can turn on this choice called Proof Colors anytime you're in Photoshop. Anytime you're about to adjust how vivid the image is, I would suggest turning that on if your primary use for the image is printing it, because then you'll have an idea of what it looks like when printed. Now there is something else that's special. We can simulate other devices. Let's say I plan on printing this image in the newspaper, but I want to print it on my desktop inkjet printer and make it look as if it would in the newspaper. Well, let's try it out. To do that, I'm going to go back down and choose Print. And when I do, in here under Color Management, we have a few choices. One is right here. It says Normal Printing. And normal printing means just make this image look as good as it can on this particular printer and paper and ink combination. But if I change it, there's a choice called Hard Proofing. And hard proofing means use some hardware to simulate what this would look like on a different device. So I'll choose Hard Proofing. Then there's this little pop-up menu here called Proof Setup. I'll say Custom. And if we're talking about printing on newsprint, I'll click here and I need a profile. A profile simply describes what happens when an image is printed on a particular ink, paper, in printer combination, and I need to see if I can find one in here that has to do with printing on newspaper. That would usually have the wording of newsprint right there, US newsprint. So I want to simulate what would it look like when I print on newsprint on a printing press. Everything in here can remain the same. Now I click OK, and over on the below the image, if I match print colors, and especially if I show paper white, the white of newsprint, the kind of paper used for newspaper, is much darker than normal paper. If I turn this on, it will really dull down those highlights. And now what I would do is if I click print, I would be simulating the look of newspaper on my desktop color printer, which is pretty darn cool. That's known as hard proofing. If you wanted to see the same thing on our screen, that would be known as soft proofing. And to do that, again, you go to the window menu, and remember that choice called proof colors? Well, we need to set it up. We just go to proof setup, choose custom, and it'll usually remember what we last set up in the print dialog. So right here, it's set to newsprint right now. And it says, let's preview what it would look like on newsprint. And if I look at it, it looks pretty dull because newspaper paper is nowhere near as white as my screen. So it ended up mellowing it out. Now, as long as I click the Done button when I was in the print dialog, when I go back to print, it should remember the last settings I had set up in here. So I don't need to specify them again. And if I save my image, they will be attached to the image. If I click print right now, it would print this image. But if I've already set this up once, I don't need to go to that dialog to print. I can go to the File menu, and there's a choice called Print One Copy. And Print One Copy means use whatever settings I last set up in the print dialog when I click the Done button to attach them to my image, and just print off one of the images. And so Print One Copy is usually what I'd end up using in the end after I've already set up everything. Now, I can't show you exactly how to set this up for every single printer, an Epson, a Canon, and Fuji, and all sorts of other brands, because each brand offers a different set of settings in the dialog where you can customize those settings. But this should give you the overall idea of how you can set up in print from within Photoshop.